Okay, thank you very much, Clayton, a friend of long date. And I also would like to thank the organizers of this webinar for this wonderful opportunity. I am a full professor at the University of São Paulo. Currently, I am retired. And I dedicated to the study of the subterranean fauna since the mid-1970s. So those are some of the results of the studies by myself and by several other colleagues and students. So let's start. Okay, sorry. This is a very important occasion to talk about the diversity of the subterranean aquatic animals in Brazil. And I will focus not only on the spots of biodiversity, but also on the conservation issues and some suggestions about water management. Caves are those spaces in the underground which are large enough for the access by humans, and which is clearly an anthropocentric definition since it is based on the size and on the locomotor abilities of a single species. Subterranean habitats, they are networks of interconnected spaces of heterogeneous sizes in the subsurface, which form a continuum available for colonization by living organisms. And this includes not only the karst, but also caves in non-karst rocks such as lava tube, and interstitious habitats like, such as the milieu souterrain superficial in the slopes of mountains, and also the hyporheic environment just below the river beds. However, I will focus on karst, of course, and the habitat units for aquatic animals, subterranean aquatic animals, are the karst systems, which are the spaces between input and output of water and form organized pathways for water. The input may be due to infiltration zones or sinkholes, or even by catchments along the system. And the water in these systems, which may include caves or not, okay, they vary from fast-flowing streams that may be permanent or temporary, and to slow-moving aquifers. And a very important component of the karst is the vertical component. So we can distinguish from the surface to the deepest part, the epikarst, which is in the interface between the surface and the next level, open channel stream passages, which are the ones we access, that includes vadose tributaries and base level streams, the zone of seasonal oscillations of the water table, and then the phreatic zones. The shallow phreatic zone may be connected to the surface through inaccessible fissures, to wells, natural or artificial, to sinkholes, and may be connected to caves, and then the deep zone. So this is the habitat unit for the subterranean aquatic animals, which is the karst systems, okay, which include all the spaces between input and output water into the rock, and they may or not include caves. In this environment, we can have from fast flow streams, permanent or temporary, to slow moving aquifers. And a very important component of the karst is the vertical component, determining zonation from the epikarst, that is in the interface between the surface and the vadose zone, the open channel stream passages, from Vadose tributaries to base level streams, the zone of seasonal oscillations of the water table, and then the phreatic zone, deep or not. Those are some examples of animals which are adapted to live on this compartment. So we have a series of animals that are typical of the suspended aquifer, permanent ones, and they only can be assessed if those animals, they are dragged by water into the Vadose zone. We have species which are restricted to Vadose tributaries, others that live in basal level streams, other species adapted to live in the shallow and others in the deep phreatic zone. And on the bottom to the left, you can see how to assess some of those species through man-made wells. All those examples, they are of troglobites, fish and crustaceans. So just very quickly, it's quite well known, a classification that comes from the mid-19th century called Schinner-Hakovitsa system that classifies the subterranean organisms, that meaning those organisms that are regularly found in subterranean habitats and which use resource that have some influence in their population dynamics. The troglophiles have both populations in source populations in both epigean and hypogean habitats, and they maintain a connected genetic connection to individuals that commute between those habitats. Well, a source population is a population that is self-sustained, does not depend on the migrant to be maintained along generations. In contrast with the sink populations, which do depend on these migrants, and if those populations are cut off from the source of those migrants, they will eventually vanish. Trogloxenes, they are source populations in the epigean, the surface, and some individuals or populations, groups of them, they use regularly the subterranean habitats like caves, but each individual must leave periodically those habitats in order to be able to complete their life cycle. There are no studied, okay, or no comproved aquatic trogloxene in Brazil. And finally, you can imagine a source population of troglophilic species that becomes isolated in this habitat, differentiates and accumulates autapomorphies, which are the exclusive character states, and they will eventually become unable to live in the surface. They are characterized by a series of specializations, including the troglomorphisms, which are those autapomorphies that may be a consequence of this particular selective regime. Okay, when you compare the total subterranean diversity, including troglobites, troglophiles, and trogloxenes, we can see that this diversity is not necessarily correlated with the diversity of troglobites. So those are quite old data, but they illustrate very well what I mean. So if you compare to the left, the São Domingos area in Goiás state with the Bambuí in Bahia area, just look at the terrestrial troglobites, you can see that the proportion of troglobites, terrestrial troglobites in Bahia is much larger than the proportion of those troglobites in São Domingos. And why is that? That's because the total diversity is dependent on current ecological conditions, such as the amount of nutrients available, the presence of bat colonies, and also the habitat heterogeneity. On the other hand, the diversity of troglobites are more dependent on historical factors. For instance, events that lead to the genetic isolation and divergence, including, for instance, paleoclimatic fluctuations and topographic barriers. So we have two kinds of diversity to be considered. Moreover, we can also distinguish taxonomic diversity, which is the number of species, total number of species that is found in a particular site. So this is species richness, quantity, just a number. But more important than the taxonomic diversity, which is generally lower in subterranean habitats than in the surface, we have the phylogenetic diversity, which is the dispersion of those species into higher taxonomic categories, genera, family, orders, and so on. And this phylogenetic diversity tends to be higher in subterranean habitats due to the filters that restrict the colonization of such habitats by many epigean species. And also the presence of relicts, that means species which know a close relative in epigean habitats. It's very important because the loss of one of those species without close relatives implies in a higher loss of diversity than the loss of species with close relatives. We also have the dark diversity, which is the absence of species, which form species pool in the surface, but are not present in subterranean habitat. The genetic diversity, which is expressed by the accumulation of autapomorphisms, reflecting in a divergence in phenotypes. So those are singularities. The functional diversity is the number of functional groups. Well, let's examine the situation in Brazil. So we have on the upper part the best studied karst areas in Brazil. From this is part of the country, from Campo Formoso in Bahia to the Alto Ribeira, and to the Serra da Bodoquena. I will discuss these areas later on. And you can see on the bottom, if you look at the Biosphere Reserves in Brazil and the distribution of the caves, we can see that they superpose, but only partially. There are important caves which are not included yet in those biospheres. Well, let's see the consequences of the paleoclimate model, which is due to the alternation between dry and wet phases. We have colonization times during the wet, usually during the wet phases, and phases of isolation, which are the dry phases. So, for instance, in Bahia, in the countryside of Bahia, this is currently Caatinga, there is dry area. And the fluctuations that we had been reconstructed by datation of spineacrims, you can see that there are very pronounced fluctuations and relatively longer phases of dry climate. In this area, you have very specialized troglobites, aquatic troglobites, including some examples of relics, such as this group of amphipods. It's a exclusively subterranean genus. Also, a very interesting case of amphibious isopods of the terrestrial group. The Calabozoa is a group very related to the isopods and amphipods, but which is exclusively subterranean. When you compare with the Alto Ribeira in São Paulo, we can see that the fluctuations were less pronounced, and also the phases of wet climate, they were longer. So there we can find several troglobites. However, they are less specialized. We don't have any relic, aquatic relic, and there is a lot of and interspecific variation. And this is also important to conserve because variation is part of the biodiversity, and it's an intermediate etap, okay, an intermediate way from the colonizers, from the troglophiles, and the very specialized relics. In Serra da Bodoquena is another very important area. This is in the edge of the Atlantic forest. And in addition to the paleoclimatic fluctuations, we have other important paleoclimatic event, which is the subsidence of the area due to the subsidence of the Pantanal basin, okay? And due to this, there is a relative uprising of the phreatic water, okay? So we had several very, very modified fishes and crustaceans, and also other invertebrates like planarians and oligopets. Those are very quickly, two other places with a very relicts, with very specialized relicts in the Northeast and also here in the Mato Grosso, which is in the central Brazil. On the other hand, what we have in this area, which is central Brazil, the São Domingos area, if you can compare, those are two reconstruction of the distribution of the phytogeographic domains in the last glacial maximum. To the left, this is the distribution of the current phytogeographic domains, and here on the right, how these phytogeographic remnants they distributed. And you can see that São Domingos is located in an area very relatively stable from this point of view. For this reason, there are very few aquatic and terrestrial invertebrate troglobites. But we have a second type of a second model isolation, which is the topographic model, so a different model, and which is the isolation due to alluvial downcutting and the presence of several waterfalls and other kinds of differences in level. So the total diversity of these species, this sport fish, is much higher than expected in view of the fluctuations, paleoclimatic fluctuations. So we have here the distribution of the troglobitic fishes in Brazil. So we have one of the most diversified fauna of fishes, subterranean fishes in the world. So this is a very important thing. And I would like to recall the fact that conservation is not only about preserving representative samples of the biodiversity, but it's also preserving patterns and process. And you have a diversity of process going on to originate this fauna. Well, now I will talk about what I think those are some failures, some problems in our Brazilian environmental legislation, because our legislation only focuses on caves. However, we must have in mind that those faunas, they are living in the system, and the system is also dependent on this influence area. So it's important to stress that a good practice would include the focus on karst systems and aquifers, not only caves, also including recharge areas, okay? Those are the recharge areas of the areias system in the Ribeira, the Alto Ribeira karst area. This area system is a hot spot of diversity of troglobites in Brazil. Also, the inclusion of epigean drainages in order to protect the epikarst that has its own fauna, and consider all kinds of diversity, total and troglobites, the taxonomic, the phylogenetic, dark functional, the genetic. So not only taxonomic and not only troglobites. Below you can see reference about on a guide of good practices in the Karst caring. Also, they include preservation units, conservation units. So we need the creation of new conservation units in areas such as Campo Formoso, Serra do Ramalho, in southern Bahia, in Nobres, in the Apodi, where, as you could see very briefly, we have very important faunas. Also, the extension and effective protection of some parks that already exist, but they do not include all the areas of influence. Most of them don't include, for instance, the headwaters. This is the case of Terra Ronca, which is the park in Goiás state. And these are the headwaters. And you can see here the karst area. So this area is crossed by streams whose headwaters are not protected at all. They are subject to pollution. Pollution is one of the most serious problems. In the Ribeira, in the Alto Ribeira, we also don't have the headwaters of one of the main rivers, which is the Betali River. It is outside the park in an area where there are tomato plantations. So tomato agriculture that uses a lot of pesticides. In Serra da Bodoquena, that's absolutely the same situation. In the Chapada Diamantina in Bahia, we have only part of those that karst area included in the park. So those parks, they must be extended to include the effect, these areas. So basically, this is, sorry for this little bit quick due to the problems, initial problems. I would like to finish acknowledging first the CaveMAB and especially to Clayton for decades of dedication for the conservation of caves and karst in Brazil, to the authors of the photographs, and to all speleologists and biologists who contributed to this knowledge, which is quite comprehensive by now, on the Brazilian subterranean aquatic systems. So, thank you.
Thank you, Leonora, Dr. Leonora Trajano. Very important your contribution for this, the understanding of the importance of to think not just in caves, but in karst systems, the connection between the surface and the underground world, and the richness of this fauna, and some strategies to protect these areas. Thank you very much. I will call Daria to help us with some comments and perhaps some doubts from our public. Daria, please.
Why do I have the honors? Leanne, you can help as well, please. So I just put down a question that maybe it's a bit silly, but I was, while hearing your presentation, I was thinking that who are and who actually should be all the stakeholders involved in the conservation of this precious underground fauna.
Well, we have legislation. Actually, it's not a law. Those are decrees, which are quite unstable. This is the first problem. And those who apply those laws are the environmental organisms, the authorities. So what we have to do is, first, we have to ask, to press for a law which is much more stable, and also to correct the decrease, because the decrease have a series of problems, very serious problems. The problem of the influence areas is one of those, but there are other problems like insufficiency of samples, which is not really, which is the rule in Brazil. And what I mention is what I consider the conflict of interests, because those interested in those economic things, they are the ones who not only pay, but they control the environmental studies. But for me, it's a conflict of interests, because they are interested in exploiting and not in preserving. So what I think is that those studies should be made on the control, let's see, of the environmental authorities. So they should be independent on the economic interest. So this is another, that's several problems. So we have to revise all this legislation. Okay, that's the point. All we can do is like this, to show what should be done and why it should be done, how it should be done, and then show this to the authorities and see if they are sensible to this.
Yeah.
Right.
You wanted to say something? No. Okay. We have two questions from George Vanny. What is the status of the current cave protection laws in Brazil? I understand it was suspended. And do you have troglobites listed as endangered to help protect cave ecosystems?
The status is the caves that are inside the conservation units, they are in theory protected. However, there are several problems, like the insufficient fiscalization. Okay, the problem is also a new problem is also the concession of the touristic activities on those areas to private stakeholders. This is not, this did not yet affect the area's conservation, but there is this pressure, very, very strong pressure for touristic activities, not only by the responsibles for the parks, but by private stakeholders. So this is a first problem. Even those that are inside the conservation units, they are not definitively protected, okay? And yes, we have some examples of troglobites that apparently they are threatened, but we don't have good studies, especially because on those cases we did not have the original status of those spaces. Sometimes we just start studying when they are already subject to impacts. So this is very difficult to show. But we have, yes, we have several species with good evidence that they are threatened, both inside the parks and outside the parks, okay? There are those that are outside the parks, they are the most vulnerable because anyone can enter. There is a problem of over-collection, even by biologists, okay? This is a problem too. So this is escalating quite quickly. I guess there is a second question, or a third question. Or...
Endangered species.
Yeah?
Caves in Brazil belongs to the government, so to explore them, you must have a special permit. For mining, it is quite easy compared to cave tourism permits, for example. Actual laws does not provide proper protection to our caves. So this is another explanation.
Yes, you do have. you need a special permit based on the results of those studies, those environmental studies. The problem is that these environmental studies, they obey legislation which is not good, okay, which is not good. It has a problem of sampling. It has a problem of, for instance, in this conflict of interest, there is some, by the interested, there are some secrecy about the data. So they only publish what is interesting, okay? So we have the legislation, we need some adjustments, but in practice, this is not what happened. And Brazil is very, very large. There's no conditions of fiscalization everywhere. So that's in theory, okay. But in practice, this is not what happens, okay? That's it.
So maybe a question for both of you, Clayton and Dr. Trajano. What do you think, how can biosphere reserves and protected areas help in this fight, or how can I put it?
Yeah. I think this is, you know, it is pressure. So we have to have the public opinion, okay, pressing for this. We must have data, good data, okay, because this is the most important, and have good science as a basis for this. Because when you have science, there is no argument against it, only economic interests, okay? But then what can we do? But this is more studies, more divulgation of those studies. Everyone must know this. There is a lot of lack of ideas. For instance, many of the authorities and the general public, they think that caves are all that exist, like holes in a solid rock. Okay, they don't have this idea that is much more than this. So this is some things you have to repeat and repeat and repeat. Later.
Yes, just to complement, here in Brazil, well, first of all the biosphere reserve, in all the biosphere reserves in our country have a lot of caves, no? Some thousands in many cases. And then it's very important for us for the issues of conservation and also for sustainable development. For the biosphere reserves are strategic sites, no? For conservation, in the special, we try to promote the declaration of new protected areas. We really propose new protected areas, many of them, and we help to implement these protected areas. We have a lot of work in some special areas for caves inside biosphere reserves. Second, we support, for instance, we have in the state of São Paulo, a state council for speleological heritage that's proposed by the Biosphere Reserve. And I'm the coordinator at the moment, no? Because we work together the question of conservation, working together with local people, universities, all the governments, of course, and all the network, including in the management system of a biosphere reserve. And then the idea to put together all these people, these institutions, it's another strategy for us. Because if we discuss together and we have transparency in the process, we can really promote the conservation of cave and karst areas. Well, we have another example in the Mata Atlântica Biosphere Reserve. We have a a cooperation with more than 10 years with mining companies. And we promote Votorantim Cimentos, for instance, is the biggest limestone company in Brazil. We have a very successful cooperation between the Mata Atlântica Biosphere Reserve, the Brazilian Society of Speleology, and Votorantim Cimentos. That's a very nice example. And with this cooperation, we protected really effectively hundreds of caves inside the areas of this mining company, because they have huge areas with a lot of caves. And and we work also with communication. We have special sites, books, photography campaigns, etc. And then I think we can do a lot to protect caves and karst with the strategic view of a biosphere reserve. No? And then we can show in other moments and giving material for people that are interested. And what are we doing here? And of course, we fight for better legislation. In Brazil, we promote in our constitution, all the caves are public now. We don't have more private caves in Brazil. Just is honored by the federal government, and we have a special center in the environmental ministry to protect the study and to protect caves. But how Eleonora told, it's a permanent fight because we have other people mining with agriculture, with agrotoxic, etc., trying to use these areas, no? And then in special some invisible areas like caves or underground waters, no? Is not just in the place of the cave. Sometimes it's far the problem, far away the problem, and came to the caves, no? And then, well, is this to finish? Is this?
I have
just only to say.
I have just a very polemic idea. When you think about the sustainability, there's a problem because the current legislation is based on a classification of caves according to their relevance. Only the maximum relevance they are really protected. And there is a problem because the relevance of the project is not opposed to the relevance of the caves. There is no. And what they do, they just point to the importance during the duration of the project, okay? Which is incompatible with the sustainability, but it's sustainability, the scale, the time scale is generations, not only 20 or 30 years. So when you increase the scales and you say, okay, let's see the relevance of this mining until the 4th generation, all those benefits will be diluted. And that's it. We have to change the scale of analysis. That's it.
Okay. Well, we must finish.
Yeah.
But just to say one information on these strategies, the Biosphere Reserve promote the training of local tourist guides and many areas with caves. We are the institution that promote more of these guides, local guides, sustainable tourism, local tourism with the communities, and that's a very strong strategy to put these guys protecting the caves and promoting the sustainable use of these areas and connect economy, in this case, social aspects and conservation. Well, we have some good example, very good examples in this area. Well, Daria and Liane, the word is with you to finish our session, please. And thank you again, Eleonora.
Thank you, and sorry once more for the
Liane, I give you the word.
Oh, I was just going to say thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Trajano. Very much appreciated in this conversation, and you know how all this is fitting together with all our different sessions. I really love it. So thank you very much. We look forward to seeing some of you or all of you on Thursday for our session with climate change, which is the decline of ice in ice caves in Tatra Biosphere, transboundary Biosphere Reserve there on Poland, the boundary of Poland and Slovakia. And so hope to see you there. Take care, everyone. Stay in touch.